The study of externalities tends to be a very popular topic for microeconomics. Many of you will end up writing your internal assessments about it. It just seems to be something that people enjoy looking at. I think what's interesting about it is it kind of brings in this idea that most of our decision making tends to be based on a bit of ignorance. We don't really see all the costs and benefits that are associated with the consumption and production of a given good or service. So this tends to be a unique way to look at how people make their decisions in an economy. Remember that we look at marginal analysis, and this means as I consume one more, then a second, then a third, then a fourth, then a fifth, as opposed to looking at what if I consume 5. Instead it says, what if I consume 5 versus what if I consume 4? Or what if I consume 6? So it's always taking a given amount and comparing it to one more or one less. That's marginal analysis in economics. We'll look at the difference between how this affects the two parties involved in the exchange, so the buyer and the seller of the good, versus how it affects other people who aren't involved in the exchange, so overall society. And then of course we're looking at costs, so what are the costs to the producer along with the costs to the consumer, and what are the benefits to the consumer and to the producer. And then once we look at society, what are the costs and the benefits to everyone else. With decision making for a private party, I'm going to choose to buy something if my private costs are less than my private benefit. Or if I'm the producer, I'll choose to produce it if my private costs are less than my private benefit. And I will continue marginally to produce and consume until my private costs are equal to my private benefit. And then once my private costs are greater than my private benefit, I will no longer produce or consume the product. This same thinking occurs for society. Society wants goods up until their costs are greater than their benefits. Once their costs are greater than their benefits, they don't want the good anymore. When we've produced to the quantity where costs and benefits are equal, that's our point of allocative efficiency that we've looked at many times. Once again, we could point out that when allocative efficiency is reached, what we're going to find is that community surplus is maximized. Based on this study, we can look at demerit and merit goods, and it's important that we understand that both of these are causes of market failure. Even though a demerit sounds like a bad thing versus a good thing for merit goods, and they are both market failures because the market fails by providing too many demerit goods. And what we'll see is that the private quantity, what we see between these two, is greater than what we will see where these two intersect. Merit goods are a market failure because the market fails to provide enough. That is, the market stops providing even though society wants more of these goods. So what we'll see is that quantity social, this is going to be our goal, and we'll always notice a discrepancy with market failure, with externalities. No, actually with all market failure. We'll notice a discrepancy that the socially optimal quantity is not produced, and instead the private quantity is, and since those two are different, that's a failure of the market because it goes against what we've defined for the market, that the market will always allocate resources in the best possible way. When we look at this diagrammatically, we make a few changes to our standard demand and supply graph. First of all, we point out on the y-axis that we're not really looking at price. We'll still use P on the axis just because it's easier, but now we're looking at costs and benefits. So we're saying, what are the costs to society? What are the costs to producers and consumers? And what are the benefits to those same three groups? Likewise, instead of calling this the supply curve, we're going to call it the marginal social cost curve. And this, instead of the demand curve, is the marginal social benefit curve. In this case, because MSB is equal to marginal private benefit and MSC is equal to marginal private cost, we don't see an externality in either of these two cases. This isn't something that you're going to produce very often. I'm just using it as a starting point to my analysis. So we're not seeing any externality there, but then we're going to see an externality down here. When we do our analysis, what we need to decide is, first of all, is it a negative or a positive externality? I know I've said this several times already, but it's because it's really important. Positive externalities, even though they're positive, are still market failure. I emphasize that because lots of students make the mistake of saying, we want to create more positive externalities. Well, if it's a market failure, why would we want to create more market failure? That doesn't make sense. So that's a very common pitfall. Make sure you don't make it. So we need to decide, is it a negative or positive externality? And then we need to decide, is the externality being caused because of consumption, or is it being caused because of production? We can tell if it's a negative or a positive externality by looking at Q private versus Q social. Again, here, what we see is if we take MPC and look at where it intersects MPB, that's this quantity here, Q private. And if we take Q social, now we say MSC and MSB, and we see they're intersecting in the same place. So that's why we can look here and say that there is no externality because Q private is equal to Q social. Whereas when we see an externality, you'll notice that they're in two different places. When we do the analysis down here, it's mandatory that we look for the quantities where MSC is not equal to MSB. And also, as we do the analysis, it's really important in this discussion that you're talking about something, some good where it's really obvious that this is occurring. You could probably get a little bit silly and argue for this to be happening in every product, and it probably is. It's just that some products are better for examples than others. When we're deciding whether it's a negative externality of consumption or a negative externality of production, or a positive externality of consumption or production, what we can tell is we can always tell by looking at, are there two benefit curves or are there two cost curves? So looking over here, since we see MPB and MSB, and they're not equal to each other, this is going to be an externality of consumption. If there were two cost curves, it would be an externality of production. By the way, you don't ever show both on one diagram. It's a bit too complex and it's not really what we're trying to get at. Okay, so let's go ahead and look at the diagram. We know it's an externality of consumption because of the two benefit curves. What we need to decide now is it negative or is it positive? So let's go do some analysis. We're looking for, are social costs greater than social benefits, or are social costs less than social benefits? We always want to start at what the market is producing. So this is MPC, and the market is going to produce up until its costs are equal to its benefits right here. Let's look from that quantity. Let's go ahead and analyze how that relates to the socially optimal quantity. We can already see that the socially optimal quantity is greater than the private quantity. So that might be enough for you already. You might have already figured out that this is a positive externality. That's good if you did, but we still need to show it with analysis. So what we're going to do is we're going to take this quantity and bring it up to the marginal social benefit curve. And what we'll notice is as we move to the right, the marginal social benefits are still greater than the marginal social costs. So this economy, this society is saying, if our costs are less than our benefits, we want this. This is something that we desire. And we could evidence that by we're willing to pay a higher price. What you'll notice is all throughout this region until we get to the socially optimal point on the Q-axis, what you'll notice is in this whole region, our costs are greater than our benefits. Once we move to the right of Q optimal, you could also use Q social here. Once we move to the right of that, social costs are now greater than social benefits. So this is society saying, we don't really want this anymore, it's not desirable. There's an easy tip on this, that whenever you look at this, you can look for this arrow that you're gonna make. You have to make sure to draw it in the right spot. For example, that would have been the wrong spot. But once you've drawn the arrow, it's really simple because we can see this arrow is pointing to the right. And on a number line, this is going to be pointing towards the positive part of the number line. There's no mathematical rule here that correlates. It's just an easy way to remember it. So when we fill in this arrow, since it's pointing to the right, we know that this is a positive externality of consumption because there's two benefit curves. I'm going to make a second video where I walk through the other three types of externalities, so watch it too. An example of a positive externality of consumption typically is going to be some sort of health-related thing. Most often we're going to use something like a vaccine or a flu shot. When I think about getting a flu shot, I'm thinking about the private benefit, how it affects me, and my private cost. What I'm not thinking about is the fact that since I'm vaccinated, since I have the flu shot, if I don't get the flu, I'm unlikely to pass it along to you. That's a good example of social benefits being greater than my private benefits. If I were thinking about, oh, not only do I not get sick, but I really reduce the chances of all of these people getting sick, well, I maybe would be more inclined to go get a flu shot. So the social benefits, the reduced chances of getting the flu are greater than just the benefits to myself.